First impressions. The lecture hall smelled of old books and expensive coffee, the particular scent of Ashford University's Humanities Building, where privilege met pretension every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 a.m. Professor Adrian Blackwood stood at the front of the room, his charcoal suit fitting him like it had been designed specifically to intimidate undergraduates. At 34, he was the youngest tenured professor in the English department, and he wore that achievement like armor. Dark hair, sharp jawline, eyes the color of a winter storm, he knew exactly what he looked like, and he used it as a weapon. Beautiful enough to make students stammer, cold enough to make them regret trying. Romanticism, he said, his voice cutting through the sleepy Monday morning haze, is not about love. It's about obsession, destruction, and the arrogance of believing your feelings matter more than consequence. He scanned the lecture hall with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a root canal. 70 students, most of them here because they needed the credit, half of them probably still drunk from the weekend. His gaze moved across their faces with clinical detachment. And then it snagged. Third row, center. A girl, no, a young woman, with dark hair that caught the light like silk, legs crossed at the ankle, pen tapping against full lips as she watched him with something that looked dangerously close to amusement. Adrian's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He didn't pause, didn't miss a beat in his lecture, but something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. He categorized her immediately: trouble. The kind of beautiful that knew it. The kind of smile that suggested she'd never met a rule she couldn't bend. He looked away deliberately. Byron didn't write about love, he continued, turning to write on the board. He wrote about damnation with a pretty face. Behind him, he heard a soft, melodic laugh. Quiet enough that most students wouldn't notice. Loud enough that he did. His hand tightened around the chalk. Dash dash dash. Her name was Seraphina Winters, though she went by Sarah, and she was absolutely everything Adrian had spent his career avoiding. He learned her name during roll call, watched her raise one delicate hand with a smile that could melt glaciers. She wore a white blouse that somehow looked both innocent and devastating, a pleated skirt that should have been modest but on her felt like a dare. "Here, Professor Blackwood," she'd said, her voice honey-smooth with an edge of mischief. He'd nodded curtly and moved on, but not before noticing the way her eyes sparkled like she was in on a joke no one else had heard. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian developed a carefully maintained ignorance of Seraphina Winters' existence. When she raised her hand, which was often, he called on other students. When she lingered after class with questions, he gave clipped, efficient answers while reorganizing papers that didn't need reorganizing. She was intelligent, irritatingly so. Her essay on Wuthering Heights had been the best in the class, dissecting Heathcliff's obsession with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of someone who understood darkness intimately. He'd given it an A- purely out of spite. But ignoring her was becoming increasingly difficult, because Seraphina Winters was not a woman who accepted being ignored. She started sitting in the front row. Started wearing perfume that smelled like vanilla and something darker, something that made him think of midnight and poor decisions. She'd catch his eye during lectures and smile, not flirtatiously, but knowingly, like she could see exactly what he was trying so hard not to feel. It was the third week when she crossed a line. Adrian was discussing Paradise Lost, pacing the front of the lecture hall with his usual controlled intensity. Milton's Satan is seductive because he makes damnation look like freedom. He convinces us that falling is actually flying. Is that what you think? Sarah's voice cut through the lecture, smooth and challenging. That falling is just flying with a different perspective. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Adrian stopped mid-stride. "I think," he said coldly, meeting her gaze with ice, "that you should raise your hand before interrupting, Miss Winters. You weren't taking questions, Professor." Her smile widened, eyes dancing with barely suppressed laughter. "I thought we were having a discussion. This is a lecture, not a discussion. You're here to learn, not to share your uninformed opinions." Something flickered in her eyes, hurt, maybe, or anger. But it was gone in a second, replaced by that infuriating smile. "Of course, Professor Blackwood. My apologies." She didn't sound apologetic at all. Adrian turned back to the board, his pulse hammering in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the fact that when she said his name, it sounded like a secret. He started staying late in his office, telling himself it was to avoid the crowds, to get work done in peace. The truth he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that it gave him an excuse to drink scotch and pretend he wasn't thinking about a 20-year-old student with mischief in her eyes and poetry in her veins. It was a Friday evening, rain hammering against the windows, when his carefully constructed walls began to crack. A knock on his door. Soft, hesitant. "It's open," he called, not looking up from the papers he was grading. The door opened. He smelled vanilla and rain. Professor Blackwood. His pen stopped moving. Slowly, reluctantly, he looked up. Sarah stood in his doorway, her white blouse clinging to her skin from the rain, dark hair damp and tumbling over her shoulders. She looked like every inappropriate fantasy he'd been trying to suppress, and she was holding a paper, his comments scrawled across it in red ink. "I wanted to talk to you about my grade," she said, stepping into his office without waiting for permission. Adrian's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around his pen hard enough to hurt. "Office hours are Tuesday and Thursday, Miss Winters. Make an appointment." "I did. You cancelled it." She moved closer, setting the paper on his desk. Her fingers were slender, nails painted a deep burgundy. "You've cancelled 3 appointments with me. I've been busy. You've been avoiding me." The accusation hung in the air between them, dangerous and true. Adrian stood slowly, using his height as intimidation. "That's quite an ego you have, Miss Winters. Not everything is about you." She tilted her head, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You're right. But this is." She was close enough now that he could see water droplets clinging to her collarbone. Close enough that if he reached out. He stepped back sharply. "Your essay was well written. The grade stands. If you're done wasting my time, I have work to do." For a moment, hurt flashed across her face, real hurt this time, unguarded. Then she collected herself, her smile returning but colder now. Of course. Wouldn't want to waste the great Professor Blackwood's precious time. She turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back over her shoulder. "You know what's funny? I'm sure you're about to tell me. You lecture about passion, about obsession, about people who let desire destroy them. But you're so terrified of feeling anything that you've turned yourself into stone." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no mischief in them, only challenge. Must be exhausting, being that controlled all the time. She left before he could respond, the door clicking shut behind her. Adrian stood frozen in his office, rain lashing against the windows, his heart pounding like he'd just run a